The rain had already soaked Christina Russell's faded sneakers when she stepped toward the iron gates of the Hayes mansion, clutching an empty stainless steel lunchbox against her chest. As the black sedan stopped, she looked straight at the CEO climbing out and whispered, her voice trembling, but never begging for pity. "Please, let me clean your mansion in exchange for one meal. I don't want your money." The housekeeper frowned. The security guard reached for the gate, but Jonathan Hayes couldn't take his eyes off the worn lunchbox in her hands. "Open the gate," he said quietly. None of them knew that one simple meal would soon change far more than one family's future. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. If stories about courage, dignity, and second chances speak to your heart, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys like this. 3 weeks earlier, long before the rain and the iron gates of the Hayes mansion, Christina Russell still believed she could fix everything with enough hard work. Every weekday her alarm rang at exactly 4:45 a.m., even though she no longer had anywhere to clock in. Habit was difficult to erase. She would quietly silence the alarm before it woke Emma, fold the blanket covering the worn-out couch where she slept, and make coffee using the last few spoonfuls left in a dented metal can. She always poured only half a mug. The other half stayed in the pot just in case she needed it later in the afternoon when exhaustion became unbearable. Their apartment sat on the 3rd floor of an aging brick building on the east side of Charlotte. The heating system rattled every night, the kitchen faucet leaked into a plastic bowl, and one bedroom window no longer closed completely, allowing cold morning air to slip inside. Still, Christina never called it a miserable place. Whenever Emma complained about the draft, Christina smiled. "We still have a roof. That's something to thank God for." Emma had learned not to argue. At only 8 years old, she already understood that her mother translated fear into gratitude whenever life became too heavy. 3 weeks earlier, Christina still had $68.12 in her checking account. She knew the exact amount because she checked it every morning. On the refrigerator held by a faded magnet shaped like North Carolina hung a small spiral notebook. Every expense went inside: milk, bread, laundry detergent, bus fare, electric bill. Each purchase was written with careful handwriting, followed by another number circled in blue ink, the balance that remained afterward. She wasn't trying to control money. She was trying to control panic. The notebook had become the only place where life still obeyed simple arithmetic. That Monday morning, after helping Emma braid her hair, Christina packed lunch. Or rather, she packed what looked like lunch. Inside an old stainless steel lunchbox, polished until it reflected the kitchen light. Despite its scratches, she placed half of a peanut butter sandwich, a sliced apple sprinkled with lemon juice so it wouldn't brown, and 3 baby carrots. She closed the lid carefully. Years ago, when she supervised housekeeping at the Magnolia Harbor Boutique Hotel, a retiring chef had given her that lunchbox. "Real workers take care of their tools," he had said. She had laughed then. Now she treated it almost like a promise. No matter how little food they had, the lunchbox was always washed, dried, and ready for another day. Emma watched her mother snap the metal clasps shut. "Aren't you making one for yourself?" Christina smiled without looking up. "I'll eat later." Emma wasn't fooled. She had noticed her mother's lunches becoming smaller every week until they disappeared altogether. But children sometimes pretend to believe lies because the truth hurts the people they love. After walking Emma to the school bus stop, Christina boarded bus Route 9 downtown. In her canvas tote rested 15 freshly printed resumes. Each page looked almost identical. Housekeeping supervisor, hospital environmental services, commercial cleaning, residential cleaning, hotel operations, 10 years of experience, excellent references, reliable transportation, available immediately. By noon, 13 resumes had been accepted with polite smiles. None resulted in interviews. One hotel manager glanced at her application for less than 30 seconds. "We're hiring internally." Another receptionist never even looked up. "You can apply online." A retirement community praised her experience before explaining they had frozen hiring. A commercial cleaning company offered overnight work, but only if she could provide her own industrial equipment and maintain a minimum number of client contracts. She thanked every person. She never argued. She never begged. She simply walked back outside, folded another rejection into silence, and headed toward the next address. Around 2:15 p.m., she entered a small neighborhood diner, not to eat, to use the restroom and refill her water bottle. The waitress recognized her. "You looking for work again?" Christina nodded. The woman reached for the coffee pot. "This one's on me." Christina hesitated, then smiled warmly. "I appreciate it, but could I leave $2? Honey, it's just coffee." "I know." She placed 2 worn dollar bills on the counter anyway. She had promised herself something after losing her job. Accept kindness and never assume entitlement. There was a difference. Outside, dark clouds gathered over Charlotte. She checked her phone. No missed calls, no interview invitations, no responses, only another automated email. "Thank you for your interest." She deleted it before finishing the sentence. At 4:10 p.m., she reached Emma's elementary school. Children rushed toward waiting parents. Emma spotted her mother and smiled, as if the day had been wonderful. "I got an A on my spelling test." "I knew you would." "And guess what Mrs. Dawson said? My handwriting is getting prettier." Christina kissed the top of her head. "I believe her." Emma looked into the canvas tote. "No job today." Christina shook her head gently. "Not today." "Maybe tomorrow." Christina smiled. "Maybe tomorrow." Neither of them realized they had begun saying those 3 words every single afternoon. Maybe tomorrow. On the walk home, they passed a small community garden squeezed between 2 apartment buildings. An elderly volunteer knelt beside tomato plants, gently tying loose vines to wooden stakes. Christina slowed her pace. The man noticed. "They'll produce again if you give them support." He wasn't speaking to her. He was talking about the tomatoes. Yet something about the sentence stayed with her long after they continued walking. That evening, dinner consisted of vegetable soup stretched with extra water and 2 slices of toasted bread. Emma happily dipped her bread into the broth. "It tastes good." Christina knew it didn't. But love has a way of seasoning simple meals. After Emma went to bed, Christina opened the refrigerator, almost empty. 1/2 gallon of milk, 1 onion, eggs, a jar of mustard. Nothing else. She opened the notebook hanging on the refrigerator. Checking account, $42, 87 cents cash in wallet, $26, 15 cents. Rent, due in 11 days. Electric bill due in 6. She stared at the numbers until they blurred. Then she quietly closed the notebook. Instead of crying, she carried the empty stainless steel lunchbox to the sink. She washed it with warm water, dried it with the same faded kitchen towel she had owned for years, polished every fingerprint from its surface. Finally, she placed it upside down on the drying rack exactly where it always belonged. Tomorrow, she told herself, it would hold lunch again. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. But as long as she kept preparing that little lunchbox for another day of honest work, she refused to believe hope had left her kitchen completely. Tuesday began with the sound of rain tapping softly against the loose window pane in Christina Russell's apartment. She woke before dawn as she always did, but this morning the air felt heavier. The optimism she had carefully carried through the previous weeks was beginning to show small cracks. Not because she had stopped believing in herself, because the calendar refused to slow down. She sat at the tiny kitchen table with her notebook calculator and a single unopened envelope from her landlord. For almost 5 minutes she stared at it without touching it. Then she finally slid her finger beneath the flap. Rent payment reminder. The balance due totaled $1,120. Late fees would begin in 4 days. Christina folded the letter neatly and placed it beneath the notebook instead of throwing it away. Ignoring numbers never made them disappear. She poured cereal into Emma's bowl, only enough to cover the bottom. Then she added more milk than usual. Emma looked down at it. You forgot yours. I'm not hungry. You said that yesterday. Christina smiled. I had coffee. Emma nodded slowly, pretending that explanation made perfect sense. Children often accepted impossible answers because they wanted their parents to remain heroes. As Emma put on her backpack, she hesitated. Mom. Yes? When you get your new job? When? Emma corrected herself with a shy grin. When you get your new job, can we go back to getting strawberries on Fridays? Every Friday for years, Christina had bought one small container of strawberries. It had been their tradition. No matter how tight money became, Friday meant strawberries. The last Friday had passed without them. Christina forced herself to smile. I think that's a wonderful plan. Emma hugged her. I'll wait. The words stayed with Christina long after the school bus disappeared around the corner. Not, I want. Not, why not. Just, I'll wait. She spent the morning walking through another list of addresses. A nursing home, a corporate office building, a medical supply warehouse. At every stop, she introduced herself the same way. My name is Christina Russell. I have over 10 years of housekeeping and facility maintenance experience. She spoke with confidence. She stood straight. She smiled. She thanked everyone. And still every conversation ended almost exactly alike. We'll keep your resume on file. We're moving in another direction. We're sorry. Around noon, she reached a recently renovated office tower where a commercial cleaning company had advertised several openings. The lobby smelled of fresh paint and polished marble. A young recruiter invited her into a small interview room. For the first 10 minutes, everything went surprisingly well. The recruiter nodded while reading her resume. You supervised 22 employees? Yes. And you handled inventory? I did. Safety inspections? Every week. The recruiter looked genuinely impressed. Then he frowned. I need to ask, why has there been a 3-week employment gap? The hotel where I worked closed permanently. I see. He typed something. We're actually looking for someone with more recent experience. Christina blinked. I was employed less than a month ago. I understand. He offered an apologetic smile. It just isn't the direction the company wants. The interview ended 5 minutes later. Outside, Christina sat on a bench beneath a bus shelter. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to close her eyes. Not to cry, simply to rest. An older janitor pushing a supply cart stopped nearby. He noticed the resume folder resting on her lap. Tough day, she laughed softly. I've had easier ones. He nodded. You know what my wife always tells me? What? Doors close loud enough to scare you before another one opens. He continued walking before Christina could answer. She watched him disappear through the service entrance. Another stranger. Another unexpected kindness. By late afternoon, she arrived at Emma's school. The children poured outside, carrying colorful artwork and backpacks. Emma ran toward her with a smile. Guess what happened? What? I wasn't hungry today. Christina smiled automatically. That's good. But later, while helping Emma unpack her backpack at home, She found the lunchbox. The apple slices were untouched. 2 carrots remained. Half the sandwich had been wrapped back inside the napkin. Emma? Her daughter froze. Were you feeling sick? Emma looked down. No. Then why didn't you eat? A long silence followed. Finally, Emma whispered, Mrs. Dawson said another little girl forgot lunch money. Christina listened carefully. So, I gave her half. Christina's eyes filled before she could stop them. And the apple? I thought maybe you could eat it. The room became impossibly quiet. Christina slowly sat beside her daughter. Honey, Emma hurried to explain, I know you skip lunch. Christina looked away. I don't. You do. Emma reached for her mother's hand. I hear your stomach at night. Those simple words cut deeper than any rejection letter ever had. Christina wrapped her arms around Emma and held her tightly. I'm sorry. Emma shook her head against her shoulder. No. I'm supposed to take care of you. You already do. They stayed that way for several minutes. Neither of them cried loudly. Some grief arrived too gently for tears. That evening, Christina searched every cabinet in the apartment. 1 box of pasta, half a jar of tomato sauce, a few packets of oatmeal, 1 onion. She calculated meals instead of recipes. If they were careful, maybe 4 days. 5 if she skipped dinner again. She opened the refrigerator notebook. Checking account $28.61. Cash $14.82. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Hope rushed through her before she answered. Hello? Miss Russell? Yes. This is regarding your application. Her heart lifted. We've decided to move forward with another candidate. She thanked them. She even wished them a pleasant evening. Only after the call ended did she lower the phone. Emma was coloring quietly at the kitchen table. What was it? Christina smiled. The wrong job. Emma smiled back. Then the right one's still looking for you. Christina laughed, despite herself. Maybe it is. Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Christina washed the stainless steel lunchbox again. She paused when she noticed something folded inside. It was a tiny piece of notebook paper. Emma's handwriting leaned unevenly across the page. For Mom. Don't worry. When I grow up, I'll buy strawberries every Friday. Love. So, Christina pressed the note against her chest. She had spent weeks trying to protect her daughter from the truth. Without realizing it, Emma had been protecting her too. The next morning before sunrise, Christina rewrote her list of places to visit. At the very bottom, almost as an afterthought, she added an address recommended by a former co-worker the night before. Hayes Estate, Myers Park. Temporary housekeeping help needed. No online application, ask at the front gate. She stared at the words for a long moment before closing the notebook. She had no idea that this single address would become the turning point neither she nor Emma could possibly imagine. Thursday morning arrived with clear blue skies, the kind that made Charlotte look hopeful from a distance. Christina wished hope could be measured by the weather. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, carefully pressing the wrinkles from her only white blouse with her palms. The blouse had been ironed so many times that the fabric had become thin around the elbows, but it was spotless. Her dark slacks had been mended twice along one seam. Her black flats showed cracks near the toes. She polished them anyway. Appearance was the one thing poverty had not taken from her. Emma watched from the bedroom doorway while tying her own sneakers. You look like you're going to work. Christina smiled. I'm going to ask for work. I think that's even better. Before leaving, Christina opened the refrigerator one more time. Nothing had changed overnight. She reached for the stainless steel lunchbox. For several seconds, she simply held it in both hands. Usually she carried it because she expected to bring food home. Today she carried it because she wanted to remind herself why she could not give up. She placed Emma's folded note back inside before closing the lid. The words were becoming a quiet source of strength. When I grow up, I'll buy strawberries every Friday. The bus ride to Myers Park took nearly 50 minutes. As downtown faded behind her, the streets grew wider, quieter, and lined with towering oak trees whose branches stretched across immaculate roads. Luxury cars glided silently past historic homes, surrounded by carefully trimmed hedges and flowering gardens. Everything looked polished. Everything looked permanent. Christina suddenly became aware of how worn her canvas tote appeared resting against her knees. She tightened her grip around the lunchbox instead. The address led her to one of the largest properties on the street. Tall wrought iron gates guarded a long private driveway lined with magnolia trees. Beyond them stood an elegant stone mansion overlooking acres of perfectly maintained lawns. She checked the paper in her notebook. Hayes Estate. She had found the right place. Taking a slow breath, Christina walked toward the security booth beside the gate. A uniformed guard stepped outside before she reached him. "Can I help you, ma'am? Good morning." She offered a polite smile. "I heard there might be temporary housekeeping work available." The guard studied her for a moment. "We're not accepting walk-ins." "I understand." She nodded respectfully. "But could someone tell me if the position has already been filled?" Before he could answer, another woman approached from inside the gate. She appeared to be in her early 60s, dressed in a Navy housekeeping uniform, with silver hair neatly gathered into a bun. Her posture carried quiet authority. "I'm Margaret Collins," she said. "I oversee the household staff." Christina introduced herself. Margaret accepted the resume without expression. "You've worked in hospitality." 10 years. "Supervisory experience." "Yes." Margaret glanced down the page. "Why did you leave your last position?" "The hotel closed permanently." Margaret nodded once. "The timing is unfortunate." Christina waited. "We're not currently conducting interviews." "I understand." Margaret handed the resume back. "You may apply through the company website when another opening becomes available." Christina thanked her. She truly meant it. She turned to leave. Then something inside her refused to take another step. Not desperation. Clarity. She looked back. "May I ask one more question?" Margaret hesitated. "Briefly. If someone needed help today..." She searched carefully for the right words. Cleaning windows, organizing storage, polishing floors. Anything." Margaret remained silent. "I could do it." "The position isn't available." "I'm not asking for permanent employment." Margaret frowned slightly. "Then what are you asking?" Christina looked down at the lunchbox in her hands. When she raised her eyes again, there was no shame in them, only honesty. "I have an 8-year-old daughter." Margaret's expression softened for the briefest moment. "My refrigerator is almost empty." She paused. "I don't want money." She swallowed quietly. "If you'll let me clean this house today." Her fingers tightened around the metal lunchbox. "I'll gladly do it in exchange for one meal." Silence settled over the entrance. Even the security guard looked surprised. Margaret stared at her. "You would work an entire day?" For dinner." Christina gently shook her head. "For the chance to earn dinner." The distinction mattered. She needed Margaret to understand that. Before either woman spoke again, the distant sound of an approaching engine echoed through the driveway. A black Mercedes sedan rolled slowly toward the front gate. The security guard immediately straightened. "The boss is back." Margaret stepped aside as the gate began sliding open. Christina instinctively moved away from the driveway, embarrassed that she was still standing there. The sedan came to a stop only a few feet away. The rear passenger door opened. Jonathan Hayes stepped out. He was taller than Christina expected, dressed in a charcoal suit without a tie. Silver strands touched his dark hair near the temples. His expression looked composed, but tired, the face of someone who had spent years solving other people's problems while quietly avoiding his own. He greeted Margaret with a simple nod. "Everything all right?" Before Margaret could answer, Kevin Brooks emerged from the front entrance carrying a tablet. Kevin was the estate's operations manager, known for keeping schedules precise and unexpected interruptions to a minimum. His eyes landed immediately on Christina. "Who's this?" Margaret answered calmly. "A woman looking for housekeeping work." Kevin barely glanced at the resume. "We're not hiring." "I've already explained that," Margaret replied. Kevin looked at Christina. I'm afraid you'll have to leave the property." Christina nodded. She should have walked away. Instead, she heard Emma's voice inside her memory. "I think that's even better." Ask for work, not pity. She turned toward Jonathan Hayes. He had been watching the exchange without speaking. "Sir." Her voice was respectful, but steady. Jonathan stopped walking. She lifted the stainless steel lunchbox slightly. Its scratched surface caught the morning sunlight. "Please." Every person near the gate became still. "Let me clean your mansion in exchange for one meal." Kevin let out a quiet breath of disbelief. Margaret lowered her eyes. The security guard looked away. Christina continued before fear could silence her. "I don't want charity. I don't want money. I just want the chance to earn enough food to take home to my daughter." Jonathan's gaze never left the lunchbox. Its polished metal reflected years of careful use. It was clean, immaculately clean. Someone who had almost nothing had still taken the time to care for it. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, that small detail struck him harder than the words themselves. He remembered another stainless steel lunchbox many years ago. Another pair of careful hands. Another life that no longer existed. Kevin stepped closer. "Mr. Hayes, I'll have security escort her." "No." Jonathan's quiet voice interrupted him. Everyone froze. He looked at Christina for another long moment. Then at the lunchbox. Finally, he spoke 4 simple words. "Open the front gate." Margaret blinked. Kevin stared in confusion. The heavy iron gates slowly began to swing inward. Christina stood motionless, unable to believe what she was seeing. Jonathan looked directly at her. "If you're willing to work for your meal," he paused, "then let's see how you work." Christina drew a slow, trembling breath. For the first time in weeks, another door had not closed. It had quietly opened. Margaret Collins led Christina through the front entrance without another word. The moment the heavy oak doors closed behind them, the sounds of the city disappeared. The foyer was breathtaking. Sunlight poured through a skylight nearly 3 stories above, illuminating polished marble floors that reflected every beam of light. A sweeping staircase curved toward the 2nd level, while fresh white lilies filled crystal vases placed with quiet precision throughout the room. Everything looked flawless. Yet Christina noticed something strange. The mansion was immaculate, but it didn't feel lived in. There were no children's shoes by the door, no family photographs on side tables, no books left open, no music, no laughter echoing from another room. Only silence. Margaret seemed to notice Christina looking around. "Mr. Hayes prefers order." Christina nodded. "I can understand that." Margaret glanced at her. "Can you?" Christina smiled faintly. "When life feels uncertain, sometimes cleaning the house is the only thing you can still control." Margaret said nothing. But for the first time since meeting Christina, she looked at her with curiosity instead of caution. They entered a small office beside the kitchen. Margaret handed Christina a simple housekeeping apron. "No uniform today." "I understand." "You'll be cleaning the east wing." Margaret unfolded a floor plan. "Library. Guest lounge. 3 guest bedrooms. Hallway windows." She paused. "Finish what you can before 5 o'clock." Christina carefully studied the map. "I'll do my best." "No," Margaret corrected gently. "Do your work." The distinction made Christina smile. "I will." Before leaving the office, she carefully placed her stainless steel lunchbox inside her canvas tote and tucked it beneath a chair. She wasn't expecting to open it until evening. Her focus belonged elsewhere. The first room she entered was the library. Floor-to-ceiling walnut shelves held hundreds of books. A thin layer of dust rested along the highest shelves, barely visible, unless sunlight struck them from the right angle. Many people would never have noticed. Christina noticed immediately. She rolled a ladder into place. Instead of simply dusting visible surfaces, she removed every decorative object one by one. She cleaned beneath each frame, straightened every book, polished the brass shelf supports, even aligned the corners so each row looked intentional. She had learned years earlier that true housekeeping wasn't about making things look clean. It was about respecting the people who lived there. As she worked, Kevin Brooks walked past the doorway carrying his tablet. He stopped. "You don't need to rearrange the shelves." "I'm returning everything exactly where it belongs." "It already looked fine." Christina smiled politely. "It'll stay cleaner longer this way." Kevin gave a skeptical shrug before continuing down the hallway. By late morning, sunlight streamed through the enormous hallway windows. Each pane overlooked perfectly manicured gardens. Christina filled a bucket with fresh water instead of continuing to use the same cloudy solution. She cleaned every window twice. Once to remove dirt, a second time to eliminate streaks invisible from inside, but obvious from the garden. Robert Ellis, the estate's chef, happened to glance through the windows while carrying groceries toward the kitchen. He stopped walking. The glass looked almost invisible. He quietly laughed to himself. "I haven't seen them that clean in years." Around noon, Margaret found Christina kneeling beside a baseboard. "What are you doing?" "There was old furniture polish trapped in the corners." Margaret blinked. "It isn't on today's list." "I noticed it." Margaret studied her for another second, then simply nodded and walked away. The kitchen smelled wonderful. Fresh rosemary, roasted chicken, warm bread, vegetables simmering in stock. Robert wiped his hands on a towel as Christina entered hesitantly. "Lunch break." She smiled gratefully. "Thank you." The kitchen staff lined up buffet style: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh rolls, fruit salad. When Christina reached the serving table, Robert handed her a plate. She accepted it. Instead of filling it generously, she chose one small chicken breast, a spoonful of potatoes, a few green beans, and one dinner roll. Nothing more. Robert watched quietly. "You can take more? This is enough. We made plenty." She smiled. "So everyone else can enjoy plenty, too." She sat alone near a window overlooking the back lawn. Before taking a single bite, she opened her canvas tote. The familiar stainless steel lunchbox waited inside. She carefully transferred almost everything from her plate into it. Half the chicken, nearly all the potatoes, the roll, most of the vegetables. Only a few bites remained on the plate. Enough to quiet her own hunger. Robert happened to walk past carrying a tray. He stopped. "You don't like the food?" Christina looked surprised. "Oh, it's wonderful." "Then why?" She smiled gently. "My daughter will." Robert glanced toward the lunchbox. You should eat. I am. Not much. She laughed softly. I'm smaller than she is. Robert knew that wasn't true. But he didn't challenge her. Instead, he quietly walked back into the kitchen. A minute later, he returned, carrying a small apple. You forgot dessert. Christina immediately reached for her wallet. How much do I owe you? Robert frowned. It's an apple. I know. I can't just take it. He stared at her for several seconds, then slowly shook his head. You're different. Christina looked confused. No. Robert smiled. You are. Most people asked for extras. More meat, another roll, dessert to take home. This woman was trying to pay for an apple. Finally, she accepted it, but only after Robert promised it was part of the meal. She wrapped it carefully inside the lunchbox. Emma loved apples. After lunch, Christina returned to work without wasting a minute. She polished the guest bedrooms until every mirror reflected light, without a single fingerprint. She folded decorative blankets with crisp corners. She vacuumed beneath beds instead of simply around them. Inside one guest room, she noticed a loose button hanging from a decorative pillow. Without asking anyone, she found a sewing kit inside the housekeeping closet and stitched it securely back into place. No one would likely notice. That wasn't the point. Good work wasn't performed because someone was watching. Good work revealed who a person was when no one watched. Late that afternoon, Jonathan Hayes returned unexpectedly from a meeting. He entered through the iced hallway while speaking quietly on his phone. Halfway down the corridor, he stopped. The afternoon sun filled the space with golden light. The windows looked as though they had disappeared completely. Outside, flowering dogwoods appeared almost close enough to touch. Jonathan lowered the phone. Hold on. He slowly walked toward the nearest window. No streaks, no dust, nothing. He reached out and touched the glass with his fingertips. It was there, almost invisible. Margaret approached behind him. Our temporary worker finished the east wing. Jonathan looked around. Every detail seemed calmer, books aligned, furniture perfectly centered, fresh air drifting through slightly opened windows. Nothing dramatic, simply cared for. He asked one quiet question. Where is she now? Margaret answered. Still working. Jonathan glanced at his watch. It ended 15 minutes ago. Margaret nodded. I know. They found Christina in the final guest bedroom. She wasn't cleaning anymore. She was kneeling beside the nightstand, carefully tightening a loose screw on one of its legs with a small screwdriver she had borrowed from the maintenance closet. She hadn't reported the problem. She had simply fixed it. Without realizing anyone stood behind her, she quietly whispered to herself the same words she always used while working. If someone trusts you with their home, leave it better than you found it. Jonathan heard every word. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, they stayed with him long after Christina stood up and respectfully wished them both a good evening. The following morning, Christina arrived at Hayes Estate 15 minutes early. She had expected the previous day to be her only opportunity. Instead, when she reached the front gate, Margaret Collins was already waiting with a clipboard in her hands. I wasn't sure you'd come back, Margaret admitted. Christina smiled. I wasn't sure I'd be invited back. Margaret's expression softened. Mr. Hayes asked that you continue through the rest of the week. For a moment, Christina simply stood there. She had prepared herself for another day of searching another string of polite rejections, another bus ride home carrying an empty resume folder. Instead, she had work. Temporary work, but work nonetheless. Thank you, she said quietly. Margaret nodded. Thank Mr. Hayes. I will. As they walked toward the house, Margaret spoke without looking at her. Mr. Hayes doesn't make impulsive decisions. Christina listened. If he extends an opportunity, he usually sees something worth investing in. Christina answered honestly. I hope I don't disappoint him. Margaret glanced sideways. So do I. Inside the mansion, Kevin Brooks was already reviewing maintenance schedules with several employees. When he noticed Christina entering, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I thought yesterday was a one-time arrangement, Margaret answered before Christina could. It was. And? Mr. Hayes changed the arrangement. Kevin forced a professional smile. Understood. But Christina noticed the disappointment hidden behind it. She quietly reminded herself that not everyone welcomed new people into established routines. She wasn't there to win arguments. She was there to earn trust. That morning, she was assigned to organize several storage rooms beneath the West Wing. Shelves overflowed with holiday decorations, old furniture covers, cleaning supplies, unused lamps, and dozens of carefully labeled boxes. Many workers would have simply stacked everything neatly. Christina first created space. She separated damaged items from usable ones, expired products from current inventory, broken tools from repairable equipment. Then she labeled every shelf by category using masking tape and a marker she found in the supply cabinet. When Margaret checked on her 2 hours later, she stopped in the doorway. The room seemed twice its original size. You reorganized everything. It'll save time later. You weren't asked to. Christina smiled while placing another box on a shelf. I know. Margaret slowly nodded. You think ahead. I try to. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes watched portions of the morning through the estate's security cameras from his office. Not because he distrusted Christina, because something about her work interested him. He noticed little things. She never hurried when quality mattered. She returned every borrowed tool to its proper place. She greeted every employee by name once she learned it. She thanked people who handed her supplies. Most surprisingly, she never once looked around to see whether anyone was watching. Her work looked exactly the same, whether she was alone or not. Jonathan leaned back thoughtfully. That was becoming increasingly rare. Just before lunch, Christina carried several empty cardboard boxes toward the recycling area behind the mansion. Instead of taking the shortest route back inside, she noticed a narrow stone pathway leading toward the rear of the property. Curiosity slowed her steps. Beyond tall hedges stood a greenhouse, or at least what had once been a greenhouse. Its glass roof was clouded with years of dirt. Several panes were cracked. Dead vines clung to rusting metal frames. Weeds had grown through stone walkways. Old flower pots lay overturned beneath benches coated in dust. Nature had quietly reclaimed almost everything. Christina stood still. The place felt strangely different from the immaculate mansion. Not neglected because no one cared. Neglected because someone had once cared deeply. She could feel the difference. She stepped closer. A faded wooden watering can rested beside a bench. Gardening gloves still hung from a hook near the entrance. Nothing had been thrown away, only abandoned. Margaret's voice interrupted her thoughts. There you are. I'm sorry. Christina stepped back immediately. I was just returning the boxes. Margaret followed her gaze toward the greenhouse. No one comes here anymore. It used to be beautiful. Margaret looked through the dusty glass. It was. She didn't say anything else. They simply returned to the house. During lunch, Robert Ellis served grilled chicken rice and roasted vegetables. Again, Christina filled only a modest plate. Again, she carefully packed most of it inside the stainless steel lunchbox. Robert leaned against the counter. You know... What? If you keep taking home half your lunch, you're going to disappear. She laughed. I've still got plenty of work left in me. Robert lowered his voice. Your daughter must be special. Christina's smile immediately warmed. The best part of every day. Robert nodded knowingly. I figured. After finishing the few bites she had kept for herself, Christina carried her empty plate back toward the kitchen. On the way, she glanced through a side window. The greenhouse stood quietly beneath the afternoon sun, almost hidden behind climbing ivy. Something inside her refused to stop thinking about it. She looked at the clock. Her lunch break still had 20 minutes remaining. Without asking anyone for permission, she walked toward the greenhouse, carrying only a pair of work gloves she had borrowed from the maintenance room. She wasn't planning a renovation. She simply knelt beside the entrance and began pulling weeds from the stone pathway. One handful, then another. She gathered fallen branches into small piles, lifted broken flower pots upright, brushed leaves from the old wooden bench. No one had asked. No one would probably notice. She simply couldn't eat while looking at something so obviously forgotten. As she worked, she found herself smiling. Gardens had always calmed her. Her grandmother had raised vegetables behind a tiny church in rural South Carolina. As a little girl, Christina had spent summers planting tomatoes, trimming herbs, and learning that neglected soil often needed patience more than replacement. She gently touched one brittle climbing rose. Most people would have called it dead. Christina noticed green beneath the bark. Still alive, just waiting. You've got a chance, she whispered. She wasn't sure whether she was speaking to the plant or herself. Unbeknownst to her, Kevin Brooks had been walking across the rear courtyard while inspecting exterior maintenance. He stopped the moment he saw Christina kneeling among the weeds. His expression darkened. What exactly are you doing? Christina stood immediately. I'm sorry. I finished lunch early, so you decided to wander the property? I noticed the greenhouse. Kevin folded his arms. This isn't your assignment. I know. Then why are you here? Christina looked around at the overgrown garden. It seemed lonely. Kevin almost laughed. The greenhouse? She nodded. I thought I could clear a little of the walkway during my break. Kevin shook his head. You don't need to impress anyone. I'm not. Then stop wasting time. She quietly removed her gloves. Yes, sir. Kevin walked away, convinced she was trying to earn attention by doing extra work. What he never noticed was that Christina left the greenhouse exactly when her lunch break ended. Not 1 minute later. Not 1 minute earlier. Back inside the mansion, she resumed cleaning windows as though nothing unusual had happened. But behind the dusty greenhouse glass, a narrow strip of stone pathway had become visible for the first time in years. Only a few feet. Hardly enough for anyone else to notice. Yet it was the first sign that someone had chosen to care for a forgotten place without expecting anything in return. By the beginning of the second week, Christina no longer needed a map to find her way through Hayes Estate. She knew which hallway caught the morning sunlight first. She knew the old staircase near the west wing creaked on the fourth step. She knew Robert Ellis always started baking bread before sunrise because warm loaves greeted the kitchen staff before breakfast. And she knew Margaret Collins liked fresh flowers placed in the entry hall every Monday, even though she never mentioned it aloud. The mansion itself seemed to have settled into a quieter rhythm, not because Christina worked faster than anyone else, because she paid attention. When she finished one assignment, she looked for another. When she borrowed equipment, she cleaned it before returning it. When she noticed another employee struggling with heavy boxes, she helped without making a scene. She treated every task with the same quiet respect. One Tuesday morning, Robert walked into the pantry carrying 2 heavy sacks of flour. Before he reached the shelves, Christina was already holding the door open. You don't have to stop working. I wasn't stopping. She smiled. I was walking this direction anyway. Robert laughed. You always happen to be walking the direction people need help. Christina shrugged. My grandmother used to say helpful feet travel the shortest distance. He smiled. I would have liked your grandmother. So would everyone else. Little by little, conversations like that became normal. The gardeners greeted her by name. The maintenance crew waved when passing in the hall. Even the security guards at the front gate began asking about Emma's spelling tests. The mansion had started feeling less like an unfamiliar workplace and more like a community. Not everyone welcomed the change. Kevin Brooks noticed it. One afternoon, he found 2 housekeepers laughing with Christina while folding freshly laundered linens. They're not paying you to socialize. The room fell silent immediately. Christina nodded. We were just finishing. Kevin looked around. The linen room should already have been completed. It is. Margaret's voice came from behind him. Everyone turned. Margaret stepped inside and examined the shelves. Every towel was perfectly folded, every sheet stacked by size, every label facing forward. She looked at Kevin. The work's done. Kevin forced a smile. Then carry on. He left without another word. After he disappeared, one of the younger housekeepers sighed in relief. I thought we were in trouble. Margaret calmly continued inspecting the shelves. Only if the work isn't done. She paused before walking away. Good job. It was only 2 words. Coming from Margaret Collins, they meant a great deal. That evening, Christina returned home carrying the familiar stainless steel lunchbox. Emma ran to the door before Christina even reached it. You're home. I am. Emma eagerly helped unzip the canvas tote. Inside the lunchbox sat grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, a dinner roll, and 2 apples. 2 apples? Robert had quietly placed the second apple inside while Christina cleaned the dining room. She hadn't noticed until reaching the bus stop. Emma grinned. Can we save one for tomorrow? We can. They sat together at the tiny kitchen table sharing the meal Christina had earned. Not received, earned. Halfway through dinner, Emma disappeared into her bedroom. She returned carrying colored paper markers and safety scissors. What are you making? A surprise. Christina laughed.
8.
I'll pretend not to look. For nearly an hour, Emma concentrated with complete seriousness. She drew flowers, tiny green leaves, a bright yellow sun, carefully cut everything out. Finally, she folded the paper in half. I finished. She handed it to her mother. On the front was a crooked drawing of 2 women standing beneath a huge tree. Inside, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for working so hard. One day I'll work hard too. I love you forever." Christina blinked several times before speaking. This is beautiful. Emma smiled proudly. You can keep it in your lunchbox. Christina looked at the stainless steel box resting beside them. I think that's exactly where it belongs. She folded the card carefully and tucked it inside beside Emma's earlier strawberry note. The lunchbox no longer carried only food. It carried reasons to keep going. The following afternoon, Christina arrived at work a little earlier than usual. She decided to spend the extra few minutes walking past the greenhouse before beginning her assigned duties. The weeds she had removed during lunch breaks had not grown back yet. Small patches of stone pathway were visible now. A little more sunlight reached the old benches. She smiled quietly. Progress. Only a little, but real. She removed several fallen branches before hearing footsteps behind her. Robert approached carrying a basket of herbs. I wondered where you'd disappeared. Christina stood. I only had a few minutes. Robert looked around. You've been doing all this? It's nothing. He shook his head. No. He pointed towards the cleared entrance. It wasn't nothing yesterday. It isn't nothing today. He walked closer. I remember this place. You do. My first week here, Mrs. Hayes used to bring herbs from this greenhouse every morning. He smiled at the memory. Fresh basil. Mint. Rosemary. She said food tasted better when someone grew it with patience. Christina listened carefully. I never met her. Most people working here now didn't. Robert looked through the dusty glass. After she passed away, he stopped. No one had the heart to touch this place. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Christina asked quietly, "Would anyone mind if I kept cleaning during lunch?" Robert smiled gently. "I don't think the greenhouse would." Later that afternoon, Kevin happened to notice fresh piles of weeds stacked neatly beside the compost bins. His eyes narrowed. Again. He found Christina dusting a hallway. "I thought I told you to stay away from the greenhouse. I only work there during lunch. That's still company property." "I know." "Then stop trying to make yourself look indispensable." Christina met his eyes calmly. "I'm not trying to look like anything. Really, I just don't like seeing beautiful places forgotten." Kevin gave a short, skeptical laugh. "This is a workplace, not a charity project." When he walked away, Christina quietly returned to dusting the hallway exactly where she had left off. She didn't defend herself. She didn't complain. She simply continued working. Late that evening, Jonathan Hayes returned from another meeting after most of the staff had already left. As his car passed the rear garden, something caught his attention. A narrow ribbon of clean stone now stretched toward the greenhouse entrance. The difference was subtle, almost invisible, yet he was certain that path had been completely hidden only days earlier. He asked the driver to stop. Jonathan stepped out of the car. He stood silently looking toward the greenhouse. The setting sun filtered through dusty glass, creating soft, golden beams inside the abandoned structure. Someone had swept the entrance. Broken branches had been stacked neatly to one side. Even the old wooden bench looked cleaner. No official work order had been issued. No maintenance crew had reported the project. Jonathan already suspected who had been responsible. As he quietly studied the forgotten greenhouse, he found himself asking a question he hadn't considered in years. Why would someone spend their own lunch break caring for a place no one else seemed to remember? He didn't yet know the answer, but he intended to find out. The next day, Jonathan Hayes canceled his usual lunch meeting. He didn't explain why. His assistant assumed he wanted an hour of uninterrupted work. Kevin Brooks believed he was reviewing quarterly reports. Only Jonathan knew the truth. He wanted to answer a question that had quietly followed him for days. Why would a woman who struggled to feed her own child spend her free time restoring a forgotten greenhouse? At exactly 12:15, he left his office through a side corridor that overlooked the rear gardens. He deliberately avoided the main pathways. If Christina truly came only during her lunch break, he didn't want her to know she was being observed. As he approached the greenhouse, the sound reached him first. Not machinery, not conversation. The soft scrape of a hand rake moving through dry soil. He stopped behind an old magnolia tree. Christina was inside. She had removed her housekeeping apron and folded it neatly over the back of a weathered wooden chair. Her sleeves were rolled above her elbows. Small streaks of dirt covered her work gloves. She wasn't rushing. She knelt beside an overgrown flower bed, patiently pulling weeds one root at a time, instead of tearing them carelessly from the ground. Every few minutes, she placed healthy plants into one pile and dead branches into another. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was handled roughly. Jonathan watched in silence. After nearly 15 minutes, Christina found an old watering can tucked beneath a broken shelf. She smiled to herself. Walking to the outdoor faucet, she discovered the water line still worked. She carefully filled the can and returned to a struggling rose bush. The soil drank every drop. She whispered almost instinctively, "There you go." Jonathan frowned slightly. She was speaking to the flowers, or perhaps to something else entirely. When she finished watering, she noticed one cracked flower pot lying upside down beneath a bench. Instead of throwing it away, she turned it over, brushed away years of dirt, and placed it carefully beside the greenhouse entrance. Even broken things she seemed to believe deserved another chance. Jonathan finally stepped onto the stone pathway. The sound of his shoes echoed lightly. Christina turned immediately. For a brief moment, surprise crossed her face. Then she stood. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes." He looked around the greenhouse. "You've apologized every time I've seen you here." She lowered her eyes. "I wasn't assigned to this area." "No." He walked slowly through the narrow path she had cleared. "You weren't." Silence settled between them. Sunlight filtered through the dusty glass roof, creating warm patches across the stone floor. Jonathan reached down and picked up a dried vine. "You've been working here every lunch break?" "Yes." "Why?" Christina hesitated. "I hope I haven't caused trouble." I asked why. She looked around the greenhouse before answering. "I don't really know how to explain it." "Try." Christina rested one gloved hand against the old wooden bench. "When I first walked past this place," she smiled softly, "it reminded me of someone sitting alone in a crowded room." Jonathan remained silent. Everyone could see it. But nobody looked anymore. She gently brushed dust from the bench. "This greenhouse wasn't ugly. It was forgotten." Jonathan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Christina continued. "My grandmother used to tell me something." "What?" "A forgotten garden is like a forgotten person." She spoke the sentence slowly, almost as though hearing it in her grandmother's voice. "If someone spends enough time caring for either one." She smiled toward the small patch of cleaned soil. "Life usually finds its way back." Jonathan stared at her. Those words landed somewhere much deeper than he expected. He looked around the greenhouse. For years he had avoided this place completely, not because he disliked it, because every corner reminded him of Grace. Grace laughing while carrying trays of seedlings. Grace kneeling beside tomato plants with dirt on her cheeks. Grace insisting that herbs grown with patience tasted different. After her death, he had closed the greenhouse door. At first for a week, then a month, then a year. Eventually no one entered at all. It became easier to leave it untouched than to remember why it mattered. Christina had never known any of that. Yet somehow she had understood exactly what the greenhouse represented. Not a structure, a memory. Jonathan looked at the cleared stone pathway. "You've done all this during lunch," she nodded. "I didn't want to neglect my work." "So you gave up your break?" "I still had enough time to eat." He noticed the familiar stainless steel lunchbox resting beside the bench. The lid stood slightly open. Only half a sandwich remained inside. The rest of the space held gardening gloves, Emma's folded card tucked safely beneath the lid, and a small packet of flower seeds Christina had found, abandoned in a storage cabinet. She quickly closed the lunchbox, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm sorry." "You keep apologizing." She laughed quietly. "I suppose I do." Jonathan surprised himself by smiling. "It must be exhausting." "It probably is." For the first time since they had met, the conversation felt natural. Not employer and temporary worker. Simply two people standing inside an old greenhouse. Jonathan walked toward the rose bush Christina had watered. "You think this one will survive?" She bent beside it. Carefully scratching away a little bark with her fingernail, she revealed a thin layer of green beneath. Yes. How can you tell? It still has life. It just doesn't look like it. Jonathan studied the tiny strip of green, hope hidden beneath what appeared dead. Something inside him tightened. Grace had once said almost those exact words while rescuing a dying hydrangea. He hadn't thought about that afternoon in years. You've worked in gardens before. My grandmother taught me. Professionally? No. Then why spend your energy here? Christina answered without hesitation. Because beautiful things shouldn't disappear just because people get busy. Jonathan slowly looked around the greenhouse once more. Busy. That was the word he had hidden behind for years. Busy running Hayes' living group, busy expanding the business, busy surviving grief by refusing to look directly at it. The greenhouse hadn't been forgotten by accident. He had forgotten it on purpose. Behind them, footsteps approached. Kevin Brooks entered the greenhouse carrying his tablet. His face immediately hardened when he saw Christina standing beside Jonathan. I knew it! Neither of them responded. Kevin continued. I've been telling everyone she's trying to impress you. Christina immediately shook her head. No, sir. Kevin ignored her. I warned her to stay away from this place. Jonathan turned slowly toward him. What exactly do you think she's trying to impress me with? Kevin gestured around to the greenhouse. This. Jonathan looked back at the cleared pathway. The watered roses, the neatly stacked broken branches, the dust-free bench. Then he quietly asked the question that made Kevin fall silent. If she wanted to impress me? He glanced at Christina. Why did she only work here during the 1 hour no one was supposed to be watching? Kevin opened his mouth. No answer came, because there wasn't one. Jonathan looked at Christina again. For the first time since Grace's death, the greenhouse no longer felt like a place that held only sorrow. Somehow, without realizing it, a woman who had asked only for the chance to earn one meal had begun bringing something else back to life. And Jonathan Hayes found himself wondering whether it was only the garden that was changing. Jonathan Hayes did not return to his office immediately after leaving the greenhouse. Instead, he wandered slowly through the rear gardens following a stone path that had once been one of Grace's favorite walks. The afternoon breeze carried the faint scent of rosemary. For a brief, impossible moment, it felt as though time had folded backward. He closed his eyes. Almost 10 years earlier, Grace Hayes had stood in this exact place, holding a basket filled with tomatoes, basil, and fresh lavender. She had laughed because Jonathan, dressed in an expensive business suit, had been trying unsuccessfully to plant seedlings without getting dirt on his shoes. You build neighborhoods for thousands of families, she had teased. But you're terrified of one little tomato plant, he had laughed. I'm terrified of disappointing the gardener. She had smiled and taken his hands. You can't grow anything if you're afraid to get dirty. Back then, the greenhouse had never been empty. Grace filled it with herbs, vegetables, flowers, and children. Every Saturday morning, she invited families from nearby shelters to visit the estate. The children planted seeds, picked vegetables, learned how tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, and herbs grew. Afterward, everyone gathered around long wooden tables beneath the oak trees. Grace cooked lunch herself. Jonathan often wondered why someone who could have hired professional chefs insisted on doing the cooking. Her answer never changed. Food tastes different when people know they matter. She never described it as charity. She called it sharing a table. Many afternoons, Jonathan returned from board meetings to find muddy footprints leading from the greenhouse all the way to the outdoor kitchen. Instead of becoming annoyed, Grace simply laughed. It means they had fun. The mansion had been louder then, full of conversations, music, children chasing butterflies across the lawn. Even Margaret Collins smiled more often. Robert Ellis experimented with recipes alongside Grace while arguing over which herbs belonged in soup. The greenhouse wasn't merely a building. It had been the heart of the estate. Everything changed after Grace became ill. At first, she simply grew tired more easily. Then came doctor's appointments, hospital stays, treatments. Still, she insisted on visiting the greenhouse whenever she had enough strength. One autumn afternoon, Jonathan found her sitting quietly beside the climbing roses. She looked thinner than ever before, yet she smiled as though nothing had changed. When spring comes, she gently touched one unopened bud. These will bloom again, Jonathan had struggled to answer. You'll see them. Grace looked at him with peaceful certainty. Maybe. Then she added words he never forgot. If I don't, she squeezed his hand. Promise me you'll keep this place alive. He promised. He truly believed he would. But promises made before grief often become difficult to keep afterward. When Grace passed away several months later, Jonathan couldn't bring himself to unlock the greenhouse. The roses bloomed that spring. No one was there to see them. The vegetables died. The herbs dried beneath broken glass. Margaret quietly suggested hiring gardeners. Jonathan refused. Robert asked whether the Saturday lunches should continue. Jonathan canceled them. Every reminder hurt. Every memory demanded something he no longer believed he possessed. Eventually, the staff stopped asking. The greenhouse slowly disappeared beneath weeds. Not because nobody loved Grace, because everyone respected Jonathan's silence. Standing outside the greenhouse, now Jonathan realized nearly a decade had passed. 10 years. 10 years of avoiding one promise. He slowly pushed open the greenhouse door once more. Inside, Christina had left everything neatly arranged before returning to work. Dead branches were stacked beside the wall. Old gardening tools had been cleaned and placed together. The cracked watering can sat upright. Even the packet of forgotten flower seeds rested carefully on a shelf. Nothing dramatic. Simply signs that someone believed this place still deserved care. Jonathan walked toward the wooden bench where Grace had often rested. He sat down. Dust no longer covered the seat. Christina had cleaned it. His eyes drifted toward the rose bush she had watered. Tiny green shoots hid beneath weathered branches. She had been right. It wasn't dead. Only waiting. A quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Hayes. Margaret stood near the doorway. I've been looking for you. Jonathan looked up. When was the last time you came in here? Margaret answered honestly. The day after Mrs. Hayes's funeral. So neither of us came back. Margaret nodded. I didn't think you wanted anyone to. Jonathan lowered his eyes. I didn't. She walked slowly through the greenhouse. She loved this place. I know. I still remember the children's laughter every Saturday. Jonathan smiled faintly. So do I. Margaret stopped beside one of the planting tables. Do you know why Mrs. Hayes always insisted the children take vegetables home? Jonathan shook his head. I asked her once. Margaret smiled through moist eyes. She told me, her voice softened. When people carry food home that they helped grow, they don't feel like they're accepting charity. They feel proud. Jonathan closed his eyes. Those words sounded painfully familiar. Work, dignity, opportunity, almost the same values Christina had quietly lived every day since arriving at the estate. Margaret looked around the greenhouse. I haven't seen it this clean in years. Neither have I. They stood silently. Finally, Jonathan asked, What do you think of Christina? Margaret answered without hesitation. I think she notices what other people overlook. Jonathan looked forward towards the rose bush. So did Grace. That evening, Jonathan ate dinner, alone, in the mansion's formal dining room. The long table designed for 12 held only one place setting. Robert personally served roasted salmon with vegetables. Halfway through the meal, Jonathan asked, "Robert." "Yes, sir." "Do you remember the Saturday lunches?" Robert smiled immediately. "I remember everyone." "What do you miss most?" Robert thought for a moment. "The noise." Jonathan looked confused. "The noise?" Robert laughed softly. "The children argued over cookies. They spilled lemonade. They ran through the gardens. They asked 1,000 questions." He smiled toward the windows overlooking the greenhouse. The estate sounded alive. Jonathan stared quietly at his untouched meal. After Robert left, he found himself unable to continue eating. He walked into the kitchen instead. The room was nearly empty. On one counter rested a basket of fresh apples. He suddenly remembered something. The lunchbox. Every day Christina carried food home. Every day she left half behind for herself. Every day she shared the better portion with Emma. She had never once asked for extra, never once complained, never once treated generosity as an entitlement. Instead, she transformed every opportunity into something someone else could share. It reminded him so much of Grace that it almost frightened him, not because they were alike in personality, because they believed the same simple truth. Real kindness didn't remove dignity. It protected it. Later that night, Jonathan opened a storage cabinet in his private study. Hidden behind old financial reports sat a small wooden box he had not opened in years. Inside lay Grace's gardening gloves, a faded notebook filled with planting schedules, and a photograph. Grace stood inside the greenhouse, surrounded by smiling children holding baskets of vegetables. On the back, she had written one sentence in careful handwriting. "A garden grows best when everyone leaves it better than they found it." Jonathan stared at those words for a long time. Then he quietly folded the photograph and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The following morning, before anyone else arrived at the estate, Jonathan walked alone toward the greenhouse. Sunlight filtered through the dusty roof exactly as it had the day before. He stood at the entrance and looked around. For the first time in nearly 10 years, the place no longer felt like a monument to loss. It felt like a promise waiting to be honored. And somewhere inside the mansion, Christina Russell had no idea that her quiet acts during unpaid lunch breaks had begun healing wounds she had never even known existed. Monday morning began like any other. Christina arrived before sunrise. She greeted the security guard, stored her canvas tote inside the housekeeping office, carefully placed the familiar stainless steel lunchbox beneath the chair, then tied on her apron. Nothing about the morning suggested that everything was about to change. Margaret handed her the day's assignment. "The North Guest Suites?" "Yes, ma'am." "And after lunch, the upstairs sitting rooms?" Christina nodded. "I'll get started." Before she reached the hallway, Kevin Brooks stepped into the office. "Hold on." Margaret looked up. "Something wrong?" Kevin held a printed schedule. "I've reassigned today's work." Margaret frowned. "Without discussing it?" "I have operational authority." He turned toward Christina. "You'll spend the day cleaning storage closets in the basement," Christina answered calmly. "Of course." Margaret watched Kevin carefully. "There are no storage closets scheduled today." "There are now." Kevin walked away without another explanation. Margaret sighed quietly. "I'm sorry." Christina smiled. "Work is work." She meant it. Whether cleaning executive offices or basement shelves, she intended to give the same effort. Downstairs, the basement smelled faintly of old paint and cardboard. The work was dusty and physically demanding. Shelves overflowed with forgotten equipment, loose cables, unused lamps, boxes of seasonal decorations. Christina simply rolled up her sleeves and began. She dusted, sorted, labeled, swept. By mid-morning, every shelf looked organized. She even created an inventory list so future employees could locate supplies more easily. When she finished, she left the handwritten list neatly clipped beside the entrance. No one had requested it. Someone would eventually benefit from it. That was enough. Around noon, she carried her lunchbox outside and walked toward the greenhouse as usual. Before she reached the stone pathway, Kevin stepped directly into her path. "Where are you going?" "Lunch." "I can see that." He looked toward the greenhouse. "You've spent enough time out there." "I'm only using my break." "Not anymore." Christina stopped. "I'm sorry. I'm instructing you not to enter the greenhouse again." She remained respectful. "May I ask why?" "Because it's private property." "I understand." "I've never entered outside my lunch hour." Kevin folded his arms. "And now you won't enter during lunch either." Christina lowered her eyes briefly. "I'll respect your decision." She turned around without another word. Instead of arguing, she found a shaded bench near the employee parking lot. She quietly opened the lunchbox. Inside rested the sandwich Robert had prepared, an apple, and Emma's folded notes. She smiled as she reread them. The disappointment she felt slowly softened. Some opportunities disappeared. Gratitude didn't have to. Several minutes later, Robert walked outside, carrying a cup of coffee. "Aren't you gardening today?" Christina smiled gently. "Not today." He immediately understood. "Kevin?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Robert looked toward the greenhouse, then back toward Christina, quietly eating her modest lunch. He disliked unfairness, but he respected her decision not to complain. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes returned earlier than expected from a meeting downtown. Margaret met him near the entrance. "I wasn't expecting you until 3. The meeting ended early. He glanced through the windows toward the rear gardens. The greenhouse looked strangely still. "No work today." Margaret seemed confused. "What do you mean, the greenhouse? I haven't been out there." Jonathan felt something was different. During lunch the previous week, he had almost always seen movement through the glass. Today there was nothing. He walked toward the rear garden. The cleared pathways remained. The roses stood watered from previous days, but the greenhouse was empty. Jonathan turned to a nearby gardener. "Have you seen Christina?" "She's eating by the parking lot, sir." "The parking lot?" "Yes." Jonathan thanked him and continued walking. A minute later, he found Christina sitting alone beneath a maple tree. The lunchbox rested on her lap. She looked up, surprised. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes." He noticed she had already packed half her meal away for Emma. Only a few bites remained on her plate. "You usually eat in the greenhouse." "I did." "What changed?" She hesitated. "I was asked not to." "By whom?" She looked uncomfortable. "I don't want to create problems." Jonathan understood immediately. "You were given an instruction." "Yes." "So you're following it?" "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "I appreciate that." He said nothing more. Instead, he walked directly back toward the mansion. Inside, he found Kevin reviewing invoices. "Walk with me." Kevin immediately followed. They stopped inside the greenhouse. Jonathan looked around quietly, then asked, "Who told Christina she couldn't come here?" Kevin answered confidently. "I did." "Why?" "She's becoming too comfortable." Jonathan remained silent. Kevin continued, "Employees are talking. They think she's special. I wanted to remind everyone of proper boundaries." Jonathan slowly faced him. "Proper boundaries." "Yes." "Did she neglect any assignment?" "No." "Arrive late?" "No." "Disrespect anyone?" "No." "Use company time?" "No." Kevin hesitated. But, Jonathan interrupted, she worked here during her unpaid lunch break. Correct. Kevin nodded reluctantly. Yes. Jonathan walked toward the rose bushes. You know what I see? Kevin waited. I see someone giving up her own rest to care for something everyone else abandoned. He turned. And somehow you decided that was the problem. Kevin's expression stiffened. I was protecting company standards. Jonathan's voice remained calm. No. You were protecting your authority. Silence filled the greenhouse. Finally, Jonathan spoke again. Effective immediately. Kevin straightened. Though, Christina may use her lunch break wherever she chooses on this property. Kevin's jaw tightened. As long as her assigned work is completed? It always is. Jonathan paused. And another thing. Sir. From now on, any change to her assignments comes through Margaret. Kevin blinked. You don't trust my judgment, Jonathan answered honestly. I don't trust decisions motivated by personal dislike. Kevin had no response. That afternoon, Jonathan called a short meeting with Margaret, Robert, Kevin, and several department supervisors. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. He spoke plainly. I expect every employee here to be treated with professional respect. He looked around the room. Titles matter. So does character. No one earns special treatment. But no one receives unfair treatment either. His eyes briefly met Kevin's. The standard applies equally to everyone. The message was unmistakable. After the meeting ended, Margaret quietly found Christina folding linens. Mr. Hayes would like you to know, she smiled, your lunch breaks belong to you again. Christina looked surprised. He did that, Margaret nodded. He believes fairness should never require permission. Christina lowered her eyes. I never wanted anyone to argue because of me. Margaret gently placed a hand on her shoulder. This wasn't about you. It was about what kind of workplace we choose to be. That evening, as Christina finished clearing a hallway window, Jonathan happened to pass by. He stopped briefly. I hope you enjoy your lunch tomorrow? She smiled. I think I will. And Christina? Yes, sir. The greenhouse looks better every day. She looked genuinely pleased. So does the rose bush. Jonathan smiled. It does. Neither of them mentioned the confrontation. They didn't need to. Some victories weren't loud. Some were simply the quiet restoration of fairness. And for the first time since arriving at Hayes Estate, Christina understood that someone in this house wasn't merely noticing her work. He was protecting the dignity with which she chose to do it. The morning after Jonathan defended Christina, the atmosphere at Hayes Estate felt subtly different. No one spoke openly about the meeting, no formal announcement had been posted. Yet news traveled quietly through every hallway. People understood one simple truth. Good work would be recognized. Respect would no longer depend on job titles. Christina, however, behaved exactly as she always had. She greeted everyone with the same warm smile. She completed her assignments with the same care. She never mentioned what had happened with Kevin. If anything, she worked even harder to ensure no one believed she had received special treatment. Late that week, Jonathan asked Margaret to join him in his office. I need your opinion. Margaret sat across from his desk. You already know it. Jonathan smiled faintly. Probably. He opened a folder containing maintenance reports. The greenhouse. Margaret glanced toward the window. What about it? I've been thinking. He paused. It deserves more than lunch break attention. Margaret nodded. It does. I'm considering restoring it. She smiled for the first time that morning. Grace would be happy. Jonathan looked down at the photograph still resting inside his desk drawer. So would I. He leaned back. The question is, Who should lead it? Margaret answered before he finished. You already know? Jonathan looked at her. Christina. Yes. She has no formal horticultural training. Margaret folded her hands calmly. No. But she notices life where other people see weeds. Jonathan couldn't argue with that. An hour later, he walked through the greenhouse alone. Sunlight now reached almost half the stone pathway. Several flower beds had been cleared. Broken pots had been grouped by size for possible repair. Dead vines had been removed from one entire wall. The transformation remained modest, but the greenhouse no longer felt abandoned. It felt hopeful. He heard footsteps behind him. Christina entered carrying her lunchbox. She froze when she saw him. I'm sorry, Jonathan smiled. I believe this greenhouse belongs to both of us at lunchtime now. She laughed softly. I suppose it does. He gestured toward the cleaned flower beds. You've accomplished quite a bit. Only a little each day. A little every day becomes a lot. She nodded. My grandmother believed that. Jonathan took a slow breath. I'd like to ask you something. Of course. If you had proper time. He looked around. What would you do with this place? Christina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly walked through the greenhouse. She imagined possibilities. This corner gets beautiful morning light. She pointed toward the eastern windows. Herbs would do well here. She turned toward another section. Vegetables along that wall. The climbing roses can stay. They're already fighting to come back. Jonathan listened without interrupting. She continued. I'd repair the broken benches, so people could sit. Children, she smiled, if children visit. She knelt beside an empty planting bed. I'd leave this one open. For what? So anyone coming here for the first time could plant something. Jonathan asked quietly. Why? Because people care more deeply about places they help build. The answer sounded remarkably familiar, almost identical to something Grace had once said. Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket. He removed the faded photograph of Grace surrounded by children inside the greenhouse. I want to show you something. Christina accepted it carefully. She studied the smiling faces, the vegetables, the flowers, the joyful expressions. Who is she? My wife. Christina looked up. She loved gardening. Jonathan nodded. She built this greenhouse. Christina gently handed the photograph back. It must have been beautiful. It was? He looked around. Then she became ill. Christina remained silent. After she passed away, he struggled for a moment. I closed the doors. She understood immediately. Not because he explained everything, because grief often needed very few words. I wasn't trying to replace what she built. She said it quietly. Jonathan looked at her. I know. I only wanted to keep it from disappearing. I know that too. He smiled gently. That's exactly why I asked you here. Christina waited. I'd like this greenhouse officially restored. Her eyes widened. Mr. Hayes, I want you to oversee it. She immediately shook her head. I clean houses. You do? I'm not qualified. Jonathan smiled. You're the only person who's been working here without being asked. She looked around uncertainly. There are professionals. I can hire professionals. He paused. I can't hire someone to care. Christina didn't know how to answer. I still have my housekeeping responsibilities. You'll keep them. He nodded toward the greenhouse. But you'll spend 2 paid hours each afternoon here. She blinked. Paid? Yes. I've been doing it during lunch. I know. I don't expect payment. I know. Jonathan's expression became serious. But I do. She lowered her eyes. For someone who had begged only for a meal, this felt overwhelming. I don't want charity. Jonathan smiled warmly. I remember. You've reminded everyone here often enough. He continued, I'm not offering charity. I'm offering work. Those words settled gently between them. Work, not pity. Responsibility, not sympathy. Opportunity, not rescue. After a long silence, Christina nodded. I'd be honored. Jonathan extended his hand. Then welcome to your new project. She shook it. Neither of them noticed Kevin Brooks watching from the greenhouse doorway. His expression remained unreadable. Later that afternoon, Margaret joined Christina inside the greenhouse carrying several boxes. What's this? Mrs. Hayes' old gardening supplies. She opened the first box. Pruning shears, seed packets, labels, twine, hand tools, everything carefully preserved. Christina picked up a faded notebook. Inside were handwritten planting schedules, sketches of flower beds, and notes written in Grace's elegant handwriting. She looked toward Margaret. These are wonderful. Margaret smiled through moist eyes. They've been waiting for someone. Christina gently turned another page. One sentence had been underlined. Gardens are grown by many hands, never just one. She smiled. I think I understand her. You would have liked her. I already do. Over the next several days, the greenhouse began changing more quickly. Jonathan approved replacement glass for broken windows. Maintenance repaired leaking pipes. Robert started delivering kitchen compost for the soil. The gardeners volunteered seedlings. Even several housekeepers offered to help after their shifts ended. No one had been instructed. They simply wanted to contribute. One afternoon, Jonathan stood outside watching everyone work together. Margaret noticed him smiling. What are you thinking? He answered honestly. I thought I was restoring a greenhouse. She followed his gaze toward Christina, laughing with Robert while teaching a young gardener how to transplant herbs. No, Margaret smiled. I think you're restoring something much bigger. Jonathan quietly nodded. He finally understood. The greenhouse had never been only about flowers. It had always been about creating a place where people felt useful, where everyone, regardless of title or income, could leave having contributed something meaningful. And at the center of that quiet transformation stood a single mother who had once arrived at the front gate, asking only for permission to clean in exchange for one meal. Now, without ever seeking recognition, she had become the person inspiring an entire estate to work together again. And 3 weeks later, their greenhouse looked almost unrecognizable. Sunlight poured through newly replaced glass panels. Fresh herbs filled wooden planters along the eastern wall. Tomato vines climbed carefully repaired trellises. The climbing roses that Christina had refused to give up on had begun producing healthy green leaves. Every afternoon, employees drifted through the greenhouse for a few quiet minutes before heading home. Some watered seedlings. Others repaired benches. Robert often arrived carrying kitchen scraps for compost. Even the security guards occasionally stopped by to admire the progress. No one had been assigned to do these things. People simply wanted to help. One Friday morning, Jonathan stood near the entrance, watching sunlight dance across the restored stone pathway. Margaret joined him. You were right. Jonathan smiled. About what? The greenhouse. It wasn't waiting for money. It was waiting for someone willing to care first. Jonathan nodded slowly. Christina reminded us. Margaret looked toward the rows of herbs. I think she reminded all of us. At that same moment, Christina was carefully writing labels for newly planted vegetables. Basil, parsley, mint, thyme. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate. Emma had insisted on helping create the colorful labels at home. Every evening, mother and daughter sat together at the tiny kitchen table, decorating wooden markers with small painted flowers. Emma considered it the most important homework she had ever received. That afternoon, Christina asked Jonathan a question. "May I make a suggestion?" "Always." She glanced around the greenhouse. "Mrs. Hayes invited children here." Jonathan nodded. "She did. I've been thinking." She hesitated. "What if we did it again?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. The idea caught him completely off guard. Christina quickly added, "Only if you think it's appropriate. I don't want to overstep." Jonathan looked toward the old planting beds where children had once laughed beneath Grace's guidance. "What kind of children?" She smiled. "The same kind who need somewhere hopeful." He understood exactly what she meant. Children whose families struggled. Children who rarely experienced places like this. Children who deserved to plant something with their own hands. Jonathan quietly asked, "What would the day look like?" Christina's eyes brightened. "We could let each child plant one seed. They could take home vegetables. Robert could teach simple cooking. The gardeners could explain how plants grow," she smiled, "and everyone could eat lunch together." Jonathan noticed something. She never once suggested giving things away. She always described participation, learning, working, sharing, exactly as Grace once had. "I think she'd approve." Christina looked at him. "So do I." Jonathan smiled. "Let's make it happen." The following week, preparations began. Margaret organized volunteers. Robert planned a simple menu using vegetables from the greenhouse. Maintenance repaired several picnic tables stored in the barn. The gardeners prepared planting stations sized for children. Word quietly spread through a nearby community center that 20 families would be invited to a Saturday garden day at Hayes Estate. Meanwhile, Kevin Brooks watched everything unfold with increasing frustration. Everywhere he turned, employees praised Christina, not because she sought attention, because her work inspired cooperation. He disliked the feeling of losing influence. Late Thursday afternoon, he reviewed payroll records. One line immediately caught his attention. Christina Russell, temporary housekeeper, additional greenhouse hours. Kevin frowned. He stared at the approval signature. Jonathan Hayes. He quietly printed the records. Not because anything improper had occurred, because he wanted evidence that Jonathan was treating Christina differently. The next morning, Kevin entered Jonathan's office. "I'd like to discuss payroll." Jonathan looked up. "What about it?" Kevin placed the papers on the desk. "You've authorized additional paid hours for one temporary employee." "I have." "That's highly unusual." Jonathan nodded. "It is." Kevin expected further explanation. None came. He continued, "Other employees may view this as favoritism." Jonathan calmly closed the folder he had been reading. "Let's examine that." Kevin remained standing. "Has Christina failed to complete any housekeeping responsibilities?" "No." "Has the greenhouse restoration benefited the estate?" "Yes." "Has she worked every additional hour assigned?" "Yes." Jonathan folded his hands. "So you're objecting because she's being compensated for work she's actually performing?" Kevin hesitated. "When you put it that way..." "I put it that way because that's what's happening." Silence settled over the office. Jonathan continued. "If another employee creates similar value, they will receive similar opportunities." He leaned forward slightly. "That's not favoritism. That's leadership." Kevin realized the conversation was over. He quietly collected the papers and left. Outside the office, Margaret happened to see him. His expression alone told her enough. She smiled to herself. For years, Jonathan had avoided difficult conversations whenever possible. Now he addressed them directly. The greenhouse wasn't the only thing changing. Saturday finally arrived. Long before sunrise, Christina and Emma reached the estate together. Emma had been invited as an official volunteer. She proudly wore a tiny green apron Margaret had sewn especially for her. "Do I really get to help?" "You absolutely do," Margaret answered. Emma looked around in amazement. "I've never seen so many flowers." Robert laughed. "Wait until you smell lunch." Soon families began arriving. Some parents looked nervous. Others seemed uncertain whether they truly belonged in such a magnificent place. Christina remembered that feeling well. She greeted every family personally. "Welcome. We're glad you're here. Thank you for coming." Not once did she use the language of charity. Instead, she handed each child a small gardening glove and a wooden name marker. "Today you're gardeners." Those 3 words transformed the atmosphere immediately. Children smiled, parents relaxed. No one felt like a recipient. Everyone became a participant. Jonathan watched quietly from nearby. Grace had always possessed the remarkable ability to make strangers feel at home within minutes. Now, standing beneath the greenhouse roof, Christina somehow accomplished the same thing. One little boy carefully planted lettuce seeds. A shy girl proudly watered mint for the first time. Emma patiently showed another child how to press soil gently around tomato roots. Laughter slowly filled the greenhouse. Real laughter. The kind Jonathan had not heard there in nearly a decade. Robert carried trays of warm bread outside. The smell drifted across the gardens. Families gathered around the picnic tables together. No reserved seating, no VIP section. Everyone shared one meal. Jonathan looked around the crowded tables. Children talking, parents smiling, employees laughing alongside guests. For the first time since Grace's passing, Hayes Estate felt alive again. As he watched Christina quietly helping a young boy carry his small potted herb to his mother, Jonathan understood something that had taken him years to learn. The greatest gift Christina had brought to the estate was never her willingness to clean. It wasn't even the greenhouse she restored. She had reminded everyone that dignity grows best in places where people are invited to contribute instead of merely receive. And that lesson was already beginning to spread far beyond the greenhouse walls. The first garden day became something no one at Hayes Estate had expected. It wasn't grand. There were no television cameras, no reporters, no speeches. Just 20 families, a restored greenhouse, warm, bred fresh vegetables, and people working side by side. Yet by Monday morning, everyone was talking about it. The gardeners couldn't stop smiling. Robert insisted the children had asked better questions than most culinary students. Margaret quietly framed one photograph showing Emma helping another little girl plant basil. Even Jonathan found himself looking at the pictures several times throughout the day. The greenhouse no longer reminded him only of what he had lost. It reminded him of what was still possible. Near lunchtime, Christina knocked gently on Jonathan's office door. "You wanted to see me?" "I did." He motioned toward a chair. "Please." She sat carefully. Jonathan opened a folder. "I've reviewed your temporary employment agreement." Christina immediately felt nervous. "Have I done something wrong?" He smiled. "You still assume the worst." She laughed softly. "I've had a lot of temporary jobs." "I'm aware." He slid a document across the desk. "I'd like to change that." She looked down. Across the top of the page, she read Hayes Estate Community Programs Coordinator. Her eyes widened. She looked up. "I don't understand. You've been doing far more than housekeeping." Jonathan folded his hands. "You've restored the greenhouse. You've improved staff morale. You organized Garden Day. You've shown remarkable leadership." Christina shook her head slowly. I was only helping. Exactly, Jonathan smiled. And that's precisely why you're qualified. She continued reading. The position included a full-time salary, health insurance, paid vacation, retirement benefits. Most importantly, stable employment. Her hands trembled slightly. I've never had benefits before. I know. I don't even know what to say. Jonathan answered gently. You can say yes. She lowered her eyes. Tears filled them before she could stop them. I've spent years wondering how to give Emma a stable life. Her voice grew quieter. I stopped hoping for opportunities like this. Jonathan waited patiently. Finally, she asked, May I earn it? He looked almost surprised. You already have. No. She smiled through tears. I mean every day. I never want this to become something I simply receive. Jonathan nodded with deep respect. I expect you to earn it every day. I promise I will. He extended the employment agreement. Then welcome to Hayes Estate. This time when Christina shook his hand, it wasn't as a temporary worker. It was as someone entrusted with helping shape the future of the place. When she left the office, she walked directly toward the greenhouse instead of the employee parking lot. She sat quietly on the restored wooden bench. For several minutes, she simply held the contract. Then she opened the stainless steel lunchbox. Inside rested Emma's newest note. It read, Mom, I think you're the bravest person I know. Love Emma. Christina smiled through tears. She carefully folded the employment contract and placed it beside every other treasured memory inside the lunchbox. The strawberry note, the handmade card, the tiny painted flower Emma had added the previous week. The lunchbox had once carried leftovers. Now it carried milestones. That evening, Christina stopped at a neighborhood grocery store on her way home. For the first time in months, she didn't calculate every dollar before reaching for fruit. She bought strawberries, fresh chicken, milk, whole grain bread. And after standing in front of the bakery for nearly 2 minutes, she picked up a small chocolate cake. Nothing expensive, just enough for 2 people. When she opened the apartment door, Emma immediately noticed the grocery bags. Mom, Christina smiled. We're celebrating. Emma looked confused. What happened? Christina knelt and handed her the folded employment letter. Emma carefully sounded out the larger words. She understood only part of it. Does this mean... She looked up. You still work at the big house? I do. Forever, Christina laughed. I hope for a very long time. Emma threw her arms around her mother. We don't have to move again. Christina hugged her tightly. No? We don't. That evening, they ate dinner together without worrying about how much food remained for tomorrow. Emma proudly placed strawberries into 2 small bowls. I told you I'd buy strawberries every Friday someday. Christina laughed. You did. Emma looked thoughtful. I guess we bought them together. Later that week, Jonathan invited the estate staff to a brief gathering inside the greenhouse. Everyone stood among the herbs and flowers Christina had helped restore. Robert carried fresh lemonade. Margaret arranged flowers from the garden. The atmosphere felt warm and relaxed. Jonathan stepped forward. I wanted to thank everyone. He looked around. This greenhouse isn't beautiful because one person rebuilt it. It's beautiful because people decided to build something together. He paused. But every meaningful change begins with someone willing to take the first step. His eyes turned toward Christina. A few weeks ago, someone asked only for the chance to clean in exchange for a meal. The staff smiled. We thought we were giving her an opportunity. Jonathan shook his head gently. The truth is, she gave one back to us. Warm applause filled the greenhouse. Christina looked embarrassed. She quietly shook her head. "It wasn't just me." Jonathan smiled. "I know. That's why you're standing exactly where you belong." After the gathering ended, Kevin remained behind. He approached Christina slowly. She turned toward him. "Mr. Brooks." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Kevin sighed. "I owe you an apology." Christina looked surprised. "I judged you before I knew you." He glanced around the greenhouse. "I thought you wanted attention." "I was wrong," Christina answered softly. "Thank you." He seemed almost relieved that she hadn't made the moment difficult. "I hope we can start over?" She smiled. "I'd like that." Kevin extended his hand. She shook it. The resentment that had followed them for weeks quietly came to an end. As the sun began setting, Jonathan stood alone near the greenhouse entrance. The evening light bathed the flowers in gold. He removed Grace's old photograph from his pocket once more. This time he compared it with the scene before him. Children's laughter had returned. Families shared meals again. Flowers bloomed where weeds had once grown. The promise he had failed to keep for nearly 10 years had finally been honored. Not because he had found the strength alone, because someone else had gently reminded him how. He looked toward Christina and Emma walking through the gardens together. Emma skipped happily between the flower beds while her mother carried the familiar stainless steel lunchbox. Jonathan smiled. Some people ask for help. Others quietly become the answer to prayers no one else realizes they've been carrying. And he knew the story of Hayes Estate was only beginning. Autumn settled gently over Charlotte. Golden leaves drifted across the gardens of Hayes Estate. The greenhouse, once hidden beneath weeds and silence, had become the brightest place on the property. Every morning, sunlight spilled through the glass onto rows of herbs, vegetables, and flowers. Every afternoon, laughter replaced the echoes of loneliness that had lived there for years. Garden Day was no longer a one-time event. It became a monthly tradition. Different community organizations partnered with the estate. Children planted vegetables. Parents learned simple gardening techniques. Retired volunteers shared advice. Employees worked alongside guests without uniforms, separating one group from another. No one referred to visitors as recipients. Everyone was simply part of the garden. One Tuesday morning, Jonathan entered the greenhouse carrying a small wooden plaque. Christina looked up from transplanting herbs. "Good morning. I have something." She wiped the soil from her hands. "What is it?" Jonathan handed her the plaque. Engraved into the polished wood were simple words. "Grace Hayes, Community Greenhouse." Beneath that was a smaller sentence. "A place where dignity grows." Christina read the words twice. "It's beautiful." Jonathan smiled. "I think Grace would approve." "So do I." He looked around the greenhouse. "I wanted people to know this place isn't about flowers. It's about what happens inside people when they're trusted." Margaret arrived carrying fresh flowers. Robert followed with warm cinnamon rolls for everyone working that morning. Emma rushed through the doorway after school carrying a drawing. "I made something." She unfolded the colorful picture. It showed the greenhouse surrounded by smiling children. At the center stood Christina holding her lunchbox. Beside her stood Jonathan. Across the top, Emma had written in careful handwriting, "Everyone gets to help." Jonathan laughed warmly. "I think that belongs on my office wall." Emma grinned. "Really? If you'll let me borrow it." She nodded proudly. "You can keep it." Christina watched the exchange quietly. Months earlier, she had worried about whether Emma would have enough food for lunch. Now her daughter felt comfortable enough to give away her favorite drawing. Security had changed them both, not by making them wealthy, by allowing generosity to replace fear. A few days later, Jonathan invited Christina to accompany him to a meeting downtown. She looked surprised. Me? Yes. They're discussing community outreach. I'd like them to hear from the person actually doing the work. She hesitated. I've never spoken at business meetings. You don't need a business speech. You only need the truth. The meeting included several local business leaders interested in supporting neighborhood projects. Jonathan introduced Christina simply. This is the person who reminded me that opportunity is more valuable than charity. Then he sat down. Christina suddenly found every eye in the room watching her. She took a slow breath. When I first came to Hayes Estate, she smiled softly. I wasn't asking anyone to save me. I was asking for work. Several people nodded. I've learned something important. She paused. When someone gives you food, they help you for a day. When someone trusts you with responsibility, they help you rebuild your life. The room remained completely silent. She continued. The greenhouse didn't change because one person donated money. It changed because many people believed they had something worth contributing. When people are allowed to contribute, they stop feeling invisible. When the meeting ended, several organizations approached Jonathan. Some offered volunteers. Others donated tools, seeds, or educational materials. One foundation agreed to sponsor transportation so children from additional neighborhoods could visit every month. On the drive back to the estate, Jonathan smiled. You handled that beautifully. Christina laughed nervously. My knees were shaking. No one noticed. I noticed. He smiled. Grace used to say courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to speak anyway. Christina looked out the window. I think she was very wise. She was. When they returned, Emma was waiting outside the greenhouse with Margaret. I have news. Emma nearly bounced with excitement. What happened? My teacher wants our class to visit the greenhouse. Christina looked surprised. The whole class? Emma nodded enthusiastically. I told everyone about Garden Day. The teacher asked if she could call. Jonathan smiled. I think we can arrange that. Emma hugged him tightly before realizing what she had done. Oh. I'm sorry. Jonathan laughed. You never have to apologize for a hug. Margaret quietly wiped away a tear. Months ago, the estate had been painfully quiet. Now children treated it like a welcoming home. Near sunset, Jonathan walked alone towards the greenhouse one final time that evening. Inside, he found the familiar stainless steel lunchbox resting on the work table while Christina finished watering herbs. You forgot this, she smiled. I almost did. He picked it up carefully. It looks heavier than when you first arrived. She laughed. It carries more now. She opened it. Inside rested the original strawberry note, Emma's handmade card, the employment contract, photographs from the first garden day, a packet of seeds from the restored greenhouse, and one additional item. Jonathan looked curious. What is this? She lifted out a neatly folded green apron, the first volunteer apron. I kept it. Why? She smiled. So I never forget where everything truly began. Jonathan looked at the lunchbox thoughtfully. It started as something that carried meals. It did. Now it carries memories. Christina nodded. And reminders. Of what? That dignity often arrives one small opportunity at a time. Jonathan stood quietly for several seconds. Then he looked around the greenhouse one last time before leaving. Children's artwork decorated one corner. Fresh vegetables filled wooden baskets. Flowers climbed the repaired walls. Employees laughed together while cleaning tools. The greenhouse had become everything Grace once dreamed it could be. Perhaps even more. Because now it belonged not only to one family, it belonged to an entire community. As Jonathan reached the doorway, Christina called after him. Mr. Hayes, he turned. Thank you. He smiled gently. No. He glanced toward the lunchbox resting on the table. Thank you for reminding us that people don't bloom because they're rescued. They bloom because someone believes they're worth growing. The evening sun disappeared behind the trees. Inside the greenhouse, lights slowly illuminated the flowers one by one. From a distance, the old building no longer looked abandoned. It looked like a lantern, quietly shining hope into the lives of everyone who walked through its doors. A full year passed, and spring returned to Charlotte. At sunrise, the Grace Hayes Community Greenhouse glowed beneath fresh green vines and blooming roses. The once-forgotten building had become the heart of Hayes Estate. Every week, children visited. Every month, families gathered around the long wooden tables beneath the oak trees. Every season, new volunteers arrived, leaving with dirt on their hands and pride in their hearts. Nothing about the place felt exclusive anymore. It felt welcoming. One Friday afternoon, Christina stood beside the herb garden, checking the day's schedule. The familiar stainless steel lunchbox rested on a nearby bench. It no longer carried her lunch every day. She had a proper office now, a regular salary, a kitchen where she never had to wonder how to feed Emma. Yet she still brought the lunchbox to work. Not because she needed it, because it reminded her who she never wanted to stop being. Emma, now 9 years old, ran across the pathway carrying a basket of seedlings. Mom! Slow down, Emma laughed. I can't. The third-grade class is almost here. Christina smiled. I noticed. Emma carefully placed the basket beside the planting tables. Can I welcome them? You've earned that job. Emma stood a little taller. I'll do my best. You always do. Nearby, Jonathan watched the conversation with quiet satisfaction. Margaret joined him. She's growing up. Jonathan nodded. So is her mother. Margaret smiled. I don't think Christina ever stopped growing. The first school bus arrived. Children poured excitedly into the gardens. Some stared wide-eyed at the greenhouse. Others pointed at the flowers climbing the walls. Emma greeted each child with the confidence of someone welcoming guests into her own home. Hi. I'm Emma. Today you're all gardeners. Jonathan heard the familiar words and smiled. They were the same words Christina had spoken during the very first garden day. Now Emma carried them forward naturally. A teacher approached Christina. I've never seen children this excited about vegetables. Christina laughed. They're not excited about vegetables. They're excited because someone trusts them. The teacher considered that for a moment. I think you're right. Inside the greenhouse, every child received a pair of gardening gloves and a small wooden plant marker. No one stood watching from the sidelines. Everyone planted something. Everyone watered something. Everyone left fingerprints in the soil. Exactly as Grace had once dreamed. Later that afternoon, Jonathan gathered the staff beneath the oak trees. It wasn't a formal ceremony. Just friends sharing lunch after another successful visit. Robert carried bowls of vegetable soup prepared from herbs grown in the greenhouse. Margaret baked fresh rolls. The gardeners brought baskets overflowing with tomatoes, lettuce, peppers, and strawberries. Jonathan stood. I have one last surprise. He looked toward Christina. Would you come here? She walked forward, slightly confused. He handed her a small, framed photograph. It showed the very first day she had arrived at Hayes Estate. Rain soaked her jacket. She stood nervously at the front gate holding Emma's hand and the stainless steel lunchbox. Neither of them had noticed the security camera that captured the moment. Below the photograph was a small engraved plaque. It read, She asked for one meal. She gave us a future. Christina covered her mouth. She couldn't speak. Jonathan looked toward everyone gathered around. A year ago, I believed I was opening a gate for someone in need. He smiled. I've realized the truth. She opened one for us. Silence filled the garden. Not an uncomfortable silence, a grateful one. Robert quietly began clapping. Margaret joined him. Soon, everyone applauded. Even Kevin. When the applause ended, Christina finally found her voice. "I don't deserve this." Jonathan shook his head. "You do." She looked around at every employee, every volunteer, every smiling child. "No," she smiled through tears. "We built this together." Jonathan nodded. "Exactly." That afternoon, after everyone left, Christina returned to the greenhouse alone. She sat on the familiar wooden bench. The lunchbox rested beside her. She slowly opened it. Inside remained every memory. Emma's strawberry note, the handmade card, the employment contract, the first volunteer apron, photographs, packets of seeds. She carefully added one final item. The framed plaque was too large, but she slipped in the small engraved card that had accompanied it. She closed the lid gently. Some people collect expensive jewelry, others save awards. She collected reminders of kindness. As the afternoon sunlight filtered through the greenhouse windows, someone knocked softly on the open door. Christina looked up. A young woman stood hesitantly at the entrance. She looked exhausted. Her clothes were clean but worn. Beside her stood a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, holding her mother's hand tightly. The woman spoke quietly. "I'm sorry to bother you." Christina immediately stood. "You're not bothering me." The woman looked around nervously. "I was told someone here might know if there's work. I don't want money. I don't want charity." Her voice trembled. She swallowed hard. "I just need a chance." For one brief moment, Christina saw herself exactly 1 year earlier. The rain, the fear, the uncertainty, the desperate hope that someone might simply say yes. She smiled gently. "What is your name?" "Monica." "And this is my daughter Lily." Christina knelt to greet the little girl. "Hello, Lily." The child smiled shyly. Christina stood again. "Have either of you eaten lunch?" Monica looked embarrassed. "Not yet." Christina glanced toward the greenhouse kitchen. Fresh soup still sat warming on the stove. Warm bread remained in baskets. But instead of leading them directly to the table, she asked softly, "Would you be willing to help us clean up after today's program first?" Monica's eyes immediately filled with relief. "Yes." "Absolutely." "I'll work as hard as you need." Christina smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." She walked to a nearby storage cabinet. From inside, she removed a neatly folded green apron, the same kind she had once worn herself. She placed it gently into Monica's hands. Then she looked toward the little girl. "Lily." The child stepped forward. "Would you like to help water the strawberries with Emma?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. Emma appeared from behind the greenhouse carrying a watering can. "Come on. I'll show you." The two girls walked away together, laughing. Monica held the apron against her chest as though it were something precious. "Thank you." Christina shook her head gently. Then, with a warm smile that carried the wisdom of everything she had lived through, over the past year she spoke the words that would become the spirit of the greenhouse for generations to come. "We don't trade dignity for charity." She helped Monica tie on the green apron. "We trade work for opportunity." As the greenhouse doors remained open to the afternoon sunlight, another family stepped inside. Not to be rescued, but to begin again. Sometimes the greatest miracle in our lives doesn't begin with someone giving us everything we need. It begins with someone believing we are still capable of building something ourselves. Christina never asked to be rescued. She asked for the dignity of honest work. Jonathan never intended to change a stranger's future. He simply chose to open a gate instead of closing it. That single decision created a ripple that transformed not only one mother's life, but an entire community. The abandoned greenhouse became a symbol of every forgotten dream that can bloom again when someone chooses compassion over judgment and opportunity over charity. We often underestimate the power of small acts, a meal earned with pride, a kind conversation, a chance to prove ourselves, or a simple yes offered at the right moment. Yet history is filled with lives changed by moments that seemed ordinary at the time. No matter how difficult your circumstances are today, never believe your story is over. As long as you keep your integrity, your willingness to work, and your hope alive, the next open door may be closer than you think. And if you are the one standing on the other side of that door, remember that the greatest gift you can give another person is not pity, it is the opportunity to rise with dignity. Kindness that empowers creates change that lasts for generations. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. What moment moved you the most, and what lesson will you carry into your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about hope, resilience, and the life-changing power of kindness, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.